the darkest corners of the galaxy, where survival means choosing between your own life and the lives of those who should be your enemies, humanity's greatest strength isn't our technology, our weapons, or our ships. It's something far more dangerous to those who underestimate us, our willingness to sacrifice everything for those we choose to protect, even when they have claws that could tear us apart and instincts that mark us as prey. The Galactic Council keeps detailed records of every species' behavioral patterns, combat statistics, and survival instincts. But there's one file they can never seem to close, one story that defies every logical prediction their greatest minds have made about human nature. It's the story of Dr. Grace, Sarah Chen, a xenobiologist who did something so impossible, so fundamentally contrary to evolutionary survival, that it changed how an entire warrior species views not just humanity, but the very meaning of honor itself. Some say courage is facing death without fear. Others claim it's protecting your own kind against impossible odds. But true courage? True courage is seeing death approaching and choosing to stand between it and cubs that aren't even your species, cubs whose parents would hunt you for sport under different circumstances. True courage is making a choice that evolution itself screams against, because sometimes being human means being more than human. This is that story. The story that made humanity's most fearsome enemies weep tears of honor, and why the proud Zephyrian warriors, who bow to no one, still leave offerings at a simple memorial on a forgotten moon, at the edge of known space. Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her palm against the cold metal wall of the research station and felt the vibration of distant explosions ripple through the structure. The emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red, and the automated voice continued its monotonous countdown in 3 different languages, none of which brought comfort. Evacuation protocols initiated. All personnel report to emergency shuttles. Station destruction imminent. 27 minutes remaining. Sarah's fingers tightened around her data pad as she watched the readings from the seismic sensors. The hegemony bombardment was systematic, professional, and absolutely devastating. They weren't just attacking the research facility. They were glassing the entire moon's surface. Nothing would survive. The xenobiology lab around her told the story of 3 years of painstaking research. Specimen containers lined the walls, each one carefully labeled with notes in her precise handwriting. Environmental suits hung from hooks like empty shells of the scientists who had worn them just hours ago, before the first warning sirens had driven everyone to the evacuation shuttles. Everyone except Sarah. She moved through the lab with practiced efficiency, her hands flying over control panels as she initiated emergency procedures. The stasis chambers hummed with power, their occupants floating peacefully in nutritive fluid, unaware that their world was ending around them. The occupants were the reason she couldn't leave. Zephyrian cubs. 7 of them, each no larger than a house cat, their metallic scales shimmering even in the dim emergency lighting. Their eyes were closed in artificial sleep, tiny claws retracted, looking nothing like the apex predators they would become. To most humans, they looked almost cute. To the Galactic Council, they represented a dangerous experiment that had gone too far. The Zephyrians were humanity's newest enemy, in a galaxy that already had too many. Standing nearly 3 meters tall when fully grown, with natural armor plating and claws that could slice through steel, they had swept through the outer colonies like a storm of death. Their warriors knew no fear, showed no mercy, and had never retreated from a battle in their recorded history. But Sarah had discovered something the Council's military advisors had missed, something that made her hands shake as she prepared the emergency beacon that would seal her fate. The cubs weren't just young Zephyrians, they were the children of the matriarch herself. 3 months ago, her research team had found the drifting Zephyrian vessel at the edge of the system. It was a nursery ship, damaged by some unknown catastrophe, its adult crew dead, but its precious cargo still alive in failing life support pods. The discovery should have been reported to military command immediately. Instead, Sarah had convinced her team to bring the cubs to the research station. She had told herself it was for science, a chance to study Zephyrian biology, to understand their development, maybe even find a weakness that could help humanity in the war. But as days turned to weeks and she watched the cubs grow under her care, she knew she had been lying to herself. She had kept them because they were children, because they were helpless, because someone needed to protect them. Now the hegemony forces were coming to clean up what they saw as a contamination risk. The cubs couldn't survive evacuation. Their stasis pods were too delicate to move, their biology too alien for the limited life support on the emergency shuttles. Moving them would kill them just as surely as leaving them would. The research station shuddered under another bombardment wave, and several glass containers fell from a high shelf, shattering on the floor. Sarah stepped over the debris without looking down. She had work to do. Her fingers moved across the holographic interface of the primary communication array. The emergency beacon she was preparing wouldn't reach human forces. They were too far away, and the hegemony was jamming most frequencies. But there was one signal that might get through, one recipient who might care enough to act. The Zephyrian fleet. Sarah had been monitoring their movements for weeks, watching their search patterns as they swept through sector after sector. They were looking for something, and she had gradually realized what it was. The matriarch's children, the future of their species. The genetic scans had confirmed her suspicions. These weren't just any cubs. They carried the pure bloodline of the ruling caste, genetic markers that appeared in less than 1% of the Zephyrian population. In human terms, they were royalty. In Zephyrian terms, they were irreplaceable. She began encoding the message, her years of xenolinguistic training serving her well as she struggled with the complex pictographic elements of written Zephyrian. The language was as precise and unforgiving as the species that had created it, with subtle variations in symbol arrangement that could change meaning entirely. The message was simple. Location. Status of cubs. Request for retrieval. What she didn't include was equally important. No mention of her own species. No indication that humans had been involved in their care. No request for safe passage or mercy. The station lurched violently, and Sarah was thrown against a wall as something massive struck the outer hull. Emergency klaxons wailed as sections of the facility lost atmosphere. She could hear the whistle of escaping air growing louder. 15 minutes to total structural failure. All personnel evacuate immediately. Sarah ignored the warning and continued working. The communication array was still functional, but barely. She had to get the message transmitted before the bombardment reached this section. Behind her, the stasis chambers continued their quiet vigil. The cubs floated peacefully, unaware that their caretaker was about to commit what anyone in human space would call treason. She was revealing their location to enemy forces, giving the Zephyrians a target that would bring their deadliest warriors directly to this facility. But as she looked at the readings showing their steady life signs, their healthy development under her care, she knew it was the only choice she could make. The transmission array finally acknowledged her access codes. Sarah took a breath and initiated the broadcast on the Zephyrian military frequency she had been monitoring. The message would propagate through subspace, reaching any Zephyrian vessels within a dozen light-years. The response came faster than she had expected. The main display flickered to life, showing the bridge of a Zephyrian warship. The creature that appeared on screen was massive, even by Zephyrian standards. Her natural armor plating scarred by countless battles, her eyes the deep amber that marked the warrior caste. When she spoke, her voice was like grinding stone, but Sarah could hear something else underneath the formal tones. Desperate hope. The matriarch spoke in rapid, complex Zephyrian, and Sarah's translation software struggled to keep up, but the meaning was clear enough. Questions about the cubs' condition, their exact location, whether they were truly safe. Sarah responded as best she could, confirming the cubs' status and providing detailed coordinates for the research facility. The matriarch's eyes narrowed as she processed the information, and Sarah saw the moment when the warrior realized what she was looking at. A human. Speaking Zephyrian. Caring for Zephyrian young. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of distant explosions and the steady hum of life support systems. Finally, the matriarch spoke again, her words careful and precise. Why? Sarah understood the question in all its complexity. Why had humans taken the cubs? Why were they keeping them alive? Why was Sarah risking everything to contact their enemies? She thought of a dozen answers. Scientific curiosity. Political leverage. Strategic advantage. All of them would have made sense to a military mind. All of them would have been lies. Instead, she said the only thing that mattered. They are children. The matriarch's expression shifted, and for a moment Sarah saw something beyond the warrior facade. Something that might have been recognition, or respect, or simple astonishment that a human could speak such words and mean them. Another explosion, closer this time, sent shockwaves through the station. Warning lights flashed as multiple systems went offline. Sarah could smell smoke and the acrid bite of venting atmosphere. The matriarch was speaking again, rapid commands being given to someone off-screen. Sarah caught fragments about jump calculations, combat formation, immediate departure. The Zephyrian fleet was moving, racing to reach the cubs before the hegemony bombardment could claim them. But Sarah could do the math as well as any starship navigator. The nearest Zephyrian forces were at least 40 minutes away, even at maximum speed. The station would be rubble long before they arrived. The display flickered as power fluctuations hit the communication array. The matriarch's image wavered, her voice cutting in and out through static interference. Sarah caught one word clearly, repeated several times with increasing urgency. Evacuation. The matriarch was telling her to leave, to get to safety before the station was destroyed. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. Her enemy was trying to save her life while her own people's allies were trying to end it. She shook her head, knowing the gesture would translate clearly enough across species barriers. She pointed to the stasis chambers behind her, then to herself, then made the universal sign for staying put. The matriarch's roar of frustration came through clearly, despite the static. More rapid commands, desperate calculations, the sound of a leader realizing that time had run out. Sarah turned back to her instruments, checking the cub's vital signs one more time. All stable, all healthy, all depending on her to keep them safe for just a few minutes longer. The station's superstructure groaned around her as critical supports began to fail. Through the viewports, she could see the hegemony bombardment ships moving into final position. They were preparing for the killing shot, the concentrated barrage that would reduce the research facility to component atoms. Sarah sat down at her workstation and began to compose a different kind of message. This one wasn't in Zephyrian or any other alien tongue. It was in simple, clear English directed to the human colonial authority that would eventually investigate what had happened here. She wrote about the cubs, about their care and feeding requirements, about the behavioral patterns she had observed during their development. She wrote about Zephyrian biology and psychology, about what she had learned from 3 months of careful study. She wrote everything that might help the next researcher who encountered Zephyrian young, everything that might prevent future tragedies. What she didn't write about was her decision to stay. That would be obvious enough from the circumstances. The final explosion, when it came, lit up the entire facility like a miniature star. Sarah felt the deck plating buckle beneath her feet, saw the walls beginning to separate from their supports. The stasis chamber's emergency power would keep them running for perhaps another 10 minutes. After that, the cubs would begin to wake as their artificial environment failed. She hoped the matriarch would forgive her for not being able to do more. The viewports cracked, and Sarah heard the whistle of atmosphere escaping into space. Her ears popped as the pressure began to drop. Emergency oxygen masks deployed from the ceiling, but she didn't reach for one. There wasn't enough time for that to matter. Instead, she moved to the first stasis chamber and placed her hand against the transparent aluminum, looking down at the small form floating inside. The cub's face was peaceful, its tiny chest rising and falling with mechanical regularity. In sleep, it looked nothing like the monster that humans had learned to fear. "I'm sorry I can't stay with you longer," she whispered, knowing the translation software would render her words into something the cub couldn't understand anyway. "But someone is coming for you, someone who will love you the way you deserve." The deck tilted sharply as structural supports failed throughout the station. Sarah moved from chamber to chamber, checking each cub one final time, making sure their life support systems were functioning at optimal levels. Her hands were steady despite everything, her voice calm as she spoke quietly to each sleeping form. The communication array sparked and went dark. The artificial gravity failed, leaving Sarah floating in the center of the lab as debris drifted around her like deadly confetti. Through the cracked viewports, she could see the stars wheeling as the station began to tumble. Sarah closed her eyes and thought about home. Earth, with its blue skies and green forests, its cities full of humans who had never seen a Zephyrian warrior and hopefully never would. She thought about her parents, who had wanted her to become a doctor and help people. She wondered if they would understand that she had become something better. She had become a bridge. The final structural failure came with a sound like thunder. The lab section separated from the rest of the station, spinning away into space with the stasis chambers still humming with power, and their precious cargo still safe inside. Sarah never saw the Zephyrian warships that arrived 17 minutes later, their weapons cutting through the hegemony bombardment fleet like a hot knife through butter. She never saw the matriarch herself lead the boarding party that recovered the cubs, her massive form moving through the wreckage with unprecedented care. But she would have been proud to know that every single cub survived. The matriarch stood in the recovered laboratory section of the human research station, now secured within the cargo bay of her flagship. The twisted metal and shattered equipment told the story of the station's final moments, but what drew her attention were the 7 stasis chambers that had somehow remained intact through the destruction. Her cubs floated peacefully inside their artificial wombs, unaware of the battle that had raged around them, or the sacrifice that had preserved their lives. The matriarch's claws traced the transparent aluminum of the nearest chamber, and she felt something she had not experienced since her own cubs had been lost: wonder at human behavior. Around her, Zephyrian technicians worked to integrate the stasis systems into their ship's power grid. The human equipment was surprisingly sophisticated. designed with redundancies and fail-safes that had kept the cubs alive through circumstances that would have killed most living beings. Every component showed evidence of careful maintenance, precise calibration, devoted care. Matriarch, her chief science officer, approached with the ritual posture of respect, but his usual confidence was shaken. We have completed our analysis of the human facility. The readings are unusual. She turned from the stasis chambers, her amber eyes focusing on the smaller male.
Explain. The human female who contacted us.
She was alone when the station was destroyed. Our scans show that all other humans evacuated hours before the bombardment began. He paused, consulting his datapad with obvious discomfort. She chose to remain with the cubs rather than save herself. The matriarch said nothing for a long moment. In Zephyrian culture, self-sacrifice for one's own offspring was expected, honorable, the foundation of their warrior code. But self-sacrifice for the young of another species, especially an enemy species, was incomprehensible. "Show me everything," she commanded. The holographic display materialized between them, showing the detailed reconstruction her technicians had assembled from the station's recovered data cores. The matriarch watched as the final hours played out in fast-forward, seeing the human female moving through the facility with calm purpose while explosions lit up the darkness around her. Sarah Chen. The name appeared in the personnel files they had recovered. 34 standard years old, unmarried, no offspring of her own. A xenobiologist specializing in interspecies development and behavior. Her academic record showed brilliance, her psychological profile showed compassion, but nothing that explained what she had done. "Replay the final transmission," the matriarch ordered. The communications log flickered to life, showing Sarah's face in the red emergency lighting of the dying station. The matriarch studied every detail of the human's expression as she spoke her final words, looking for signs of deception or hidden motive. She found none. "They are children." The simplicity of the statement was what made it so profound. No political calculation, no strategic advantage, no complex reasoning. Just a truth so fundamental that the human had been willing to die for it. The science officer cleared his throat nervously. "Matriarch, there is something else. We found this in the station's computer systems." A new file opened, and the matriarch found herself looking at detailed behavioral observations, feeding schedules, growth measurements, and what could only be described as loving care notes. 3 months of meticulous documentation showing how a human scientist had devoted herself to understanding and nurturing Zephyrian young. The notes revealed something that made the matriarch's chest tighten with an emotion she rarely allowed herself to feel. The human had named each cub, not with the formal designations that Zephyrian tradition demanded, but with soft human sounds that somehow captured each young one's emerging personality. Storm Eyes for the cub, who showed early signs of leadership. Gentle Claws for the one who was slower to aggression. Shadow Walker for the one who preferred to observe before acting. Sarah Chen had seen them not as specimens or political assets, but as individuals, as persons worthy of names and love and sacrifice. "Bring me War Leader Thrak," the matriarch commanded. Her most trusted advisor arrived within minutes, his scarred hide bearing the marks of 100 battles. Thrak had been with her since the early days of their expansion, had helped plan the strategies that had driven human forces from a dozen worlds. If anyone could explain human military thinking, it was him. "You have studied our enemies extensively," the matriarch began without preamble. "Does their behavior here fit any pattern you recognize?" Thrak examined the holographic displays, his predator's eyes taking in every detail of the station's final moments. His expression grew more puzzled with each passing moment. "No, matriarch. This contradicts everything we know about human psychology. They are territorial creatures, fiercely protective of their own young, but historically indifferent to other species. Their military doctrine emphasizes pragmatic decision-making and survival at all costs." He gestured at the image of Sarah Chan. "This individual's actions make no tactical sense. Yet she acted as she did. Why?" Thrak's silence stretched for nearly a full minute before he answered. "Perhaps we have misunderstood something fundamental about their nature." The matriarch moved to the recovered laboratory equipment, examining the careful modifications Sarah had made to accommodate Zephyrian biology. Temperature controls adjusted to match their homeworld. Nutritional supplements tailored to their metabolic needs. Even toys, simple objects designed to stimulate developing minds. In the corner of the lab, she found something that stopped her cold. A small shrine, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. 7 small holographic projectors, each one displaying images that the station's computers had somehow preserved. Pictures of adult Zephyrians, their postures and markings identifying them as members of the ruling caste. Sarah Chen had somehow obtained recordings of the cubs' parents and programmed them to play during feeding times. She had wanted the cubs to know where they came from. The matriarch's claws extended involuntarily as the full implication hit her. This human had not only saved her grandchildren's lives, but had tried to preserve their connection to their heritage. She had cared for them not as captives or experiments, but as honored guests who deserved to know their own history. "War leader," she said quietly, "I want you to access every record we have of human behavior in combat. Look for patterns of self-sacrifice, protection of non-combatants, care for enemy wounded. Search for anything that explains what we have seen here." As Thrak hurried away to carry out her orders, the matriarch remained alone with the stasis chambers and the ghost of a human scientist who had changed everything she thought she knew about their enemy. Over the following days, as their fleet made its way back to Zephyrian space, the reports began to arrive. Incidents that military intelligence had dismissed as anomalies suddenly took on new significance when viewed through the lens of Sarah Chen's sacrifice. Human soldiers who had died defending alien refugees during the evacuation of Kepler Station. Medical personnel who had remained behind on contested worlds to treat wounded civilians of all species. Rescue ships that had answered distress calls from enemy vessels, often at great risk to themselves. The pattern was there once you knew how to look for it. Humans possessed something that Zephyrian strategic doctrine had failed to account for. The ability to expand their definition of us, to include beings they had never met, from species they barely understood. "It is irrational," War Leader Thrak reported during their daily briefing. "From a survival standpoint, these behaviors should have been eliminated by natural selection millennia ago. Yet they appear to be increasing in frequency as human civilization advances." The matriarch studied the data scrolling past on her screens. Hundreds of incidents, thousands of individual acts of courage and compassion that their intelligence services had catalogued without understanding their significance. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "rationality is not the only measure of evolutionary success." The journey back to the homeworld took 18 standard days. During that time, the matriarch found herself spending hours each day in the cargo bay, watching over the cubs and reading through Sarah Chen's research notes. The human's writing revealed a mind that was both scientifically rigorous and deeply empathetic. Someone who saw the wonder in every new discovery. The cubs were beginning to show signs of awakening. Their sleep cycles were naturally decreasing as their development progressed, and soon they would need to be transferred to more conventional nursery facilities. The matriarch had already sent word ahead, requesting that the finest caregivers in Zephyrian space be prepared to receive them. But she wondered if any of them would show the same devotion that Sarah Chen had demonstrated. On the final day of their journey, as the homeworld's golden sun grew larger in their viewports, the matriarch made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks before. She called for a meeting of the High Council. The great chamber aboard her flagship, filled with holographic projections of the most powerful Zephyrians in known space. Military commanders, territorial governors, the heads of the great clans. They had come expecting a celebration of the Cubs' recovery, a planning session for their continued war against humanity. Instead, the matriarch showed them the complete record of Sarah Chen's actions. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Roars of disbelief, accusations of human deception, demands for increased military action against the species that had dared to touch Zephyrian young. But the matriarch let them rage until their fury was spent, then spoke into the sudden silence. "This human died for our children. She asked for nothing in return, sought no advantage, expected no mercy. She simply saw young lives in danger and chose to protect them at the cost of her own." Elder Korath, the oldest member of the council, leaned forward in his projection field. "You speak as if this changes something, matriarch. One individual's actions do not negate the crimes of her species, don't they?" The matriarch gestured to the stasis chambers visible behind her. "These cubs live because of her sacrifice. They will grow to adulthood, will have cubs of their own, will carry our bloodline into the future." How many Zephyrian warriors would have made the same choice for human young? The silence that followed her question was answer enough. War Leader Thruk spoke carefully. "Matriarch, you cannot be suggesting that we cease hostilities based on the actions of a single human." "I am suggesting," the matriarch replied, "that we may have been fighting the wrong war." She began to pace, her massive form moving with predatory grace around the cargo bay. "We have always believed that the galaxy was divided between predators and prey, between the strong who take and the weak who are taken from. But this human has shown us a third path, The holographic display shifted to show Sarah Chen's final message, her calm face speaking words of love and protection to cubs she had never seen awake. She became something we did not think possible, a guardian. A protector who chose to guard not her own kind, but ours. If humans are capable of such evolution, then perhaps the future holds possibilities we have not imagined.
The council members exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from confusion to outright hostility. This was not the matriarch they knew, the Iron World leader who had expanded their territory through a dozen successful campaigns.
"What would you have us do?" Elder Korath asked finally. The matriarch looked down at the nearest stasis chamber, where Storm Eyes floated in peaceful sleep. Soon the cub would wake to a world changed by one human's choice, to see children where others saw enemies. "I would have us remember," she said quietly, "that the measure of a species is not in how they treat their friends, but in how they treat their enemies young." 25 years had passed since the day Dr. Sarah Chen died protecting 7 Zephyrian cubs, and the galaxy had changed in ways that no strategist could have predicted. The memorial stood on what had once been a forgotten moon at the edge of nowhere, the site where the research station had made its final stand against the hegemony bombardment. But the moon was no longer forgotten, and the memorial was no longer simple. What had begun as a modest marker placed by Zephyrian warriors had grown into something unprecedented in galactic history. Representatives from dozens of species had added their own tributes over the years, creating a complex of monuments that spoke to the power of a single act of sacrifice. Ambassador Elena Vasquez walked the memorial pathway with measured steps, her diplomatic training warring with the emotion that always struck her when she visited this place. As the human representative to the Galactic Council, she had attended hundreds of formal ceremonies, but none had ever felt as significant as today's gathering. Today, for the first time since Sarah Chen's death, all 7 of the cubs she had saved would return to the place where their lives had been preserved. "The weather control systems have been optimized for the ceremony," reported Commander Torres, her security chief. "We're expecting representatives from 47 different species, including several from the non-aligned worlds. The Zephyrians have provided their entire 3rd Fleet as escort." Elena nodded, but her attention was focused on the central monument ahead of them. Sarah Chen's image was rendered in crystalline light, a permanent hologram that showed her as she had been in her final transmission. Calm, determined, utterly human in her willingness to sacrifice everything for children who weren't her own.
Around the base of the memorial, offerings from visitors created a constantly changing display of galactic diversity.
Zephyrian battleclaws laid down in gestures of respect. Crystalline song pods from the ethereals that played haunting melodies when the wind touched them. Living flowers from a dozen worlds, their roots somehow finding purchase in the artificial soil. And always, somewhere in the mix, simple items left by human visitors. Photographs of children, toys that looked similar to the ones Sarah had crafted for her alien charges. Messages written in 100 human languages, all saying variations of the same thing. "Thank you for showing them who we really are." "Ambassador," Torres said quietly, "incoming vessel on approach vector 7. It's the Zephyrian delegation." The ship that settled onto the landing pad was unlike anything in the Zephyrian fleet. Where their warships were angular and aggressive, this vessel curved with organic grace, its hull decorated with flowing patterns that spoke of celebration rather than conquest. It was a clan ship, Elena realized, designed for ceremonies of highest honor. The airlock opened, and Storm Eyes emerged into the golden afternoon light of the memorial world. Elena had met him several times over the years, but his presence never failed to impress her. At full maturity, he stood nearly 4 meters tall, his metallic scales bearing the deep gold coloration that marked the royal bloodline. But it was his eyes that marked him as different from other Zephyrians. They held a depth of understanding that came from growing up with the story of his salvation. Behind him came his 6 siblings, equally impressive, equally changed by the circumstances of their rescue. They moved with the fluid grace of their species, but there was something in their posture that Elena had never seen in other Zephyrians. A quality that human observers had learned to recognize over the years. Gentleness. "Ambassador Vasquez," Storm Eyes spoke in accented but fluent standard, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones that made Zephyrian speech so distinctive. "It honors us to return to this place on such a day."
"The honor is ours," Elena replied, offering the formal gesture of respect that had become standard in human Zephyrian diplomatic exchanges.
"Your presence here means everything to our people." As they walked together toward the memorial, Elena reflected on the changes that Storm Eyes and his siblings had brought to the galaxy. They had grown up knowing the story of their rescue, understanding from their earliest days that a human had chosen to die rather than see them come to harm.
That knowledge had shaped them in ways that no one could have anticipated. Storm Eyes had become an advocate for what the galactic press had dubbed the Chen Doctrine, the radical idea that protecting innocent life transcended species boundaries. His speeches at the Galactic Council had moved audiences to tears. His presence at peace negotiations had prevented 3 different wars, and his simple existence served as proof that understanding between species was possible. His siblings had followed similar paths. Gentle Claws had become a healer, developing medical techniques that worked across species barriers. Shadow Walker had joined the Galactic Rangers, the peacekeeping force that protected shipping lanes and responded to disasters anywhere in known space. Each of them had found ways to honor the sacrifice that had saved their lives. But perhaps more importantly, they had influenced their own species in ways that rippled outward through Zephyrian society. The war between humanity and the Zephyrian Empire had not ended overnight. It had taken 5 years of careful negotiation, prisoner exchanges, and gradual de-escalation before the formal peace accords were signed. But the process had been possible only because the Cub's story had given both sides a reason to believe that peace might be worth the effort. "The matriarch sends her regards," Storm Eyes said as they approached the central memorial. "She wishes she could be here today, but the Council of Clans requires her presence for the ratification votes." Elena nodded with understanding. The matriarch was now the acknowledged leader of the Zephyrian people, her authority strengthened rather than weakened by her decision to end the war with humanity. The rescue of her grandchildren had become the foundation myth of a new age in Zephyrian culture, proof that sometimes the greatest strength came from choosing mercy over conquest. The ceremony began as the afternoon sun reached its zenith, casting the memorial in brilliant light that made Sarah Chen's holographic image seem almost alive. Representatives from across the galaxy gathered in concentric circles around the monument, their diverse forms creating a visual testament to the unity that one person's sacrifice had helped inspire. Storm Eyes stepped forward to address the assembly, his voice carrying clearly across the gathering despite the absence of amplification systems. 25 years ago, he began, a human scientist named Sarah Chen made a choice that changed the course of galactic history. She did not know our names, had never seen us awake, had no reason to believe that we would remember or honor her sacrifice. She acted not from calculation or strategy, but from a simple recognition that all children deserve protection. He paused, his amber eyes scanning the crowd. Today we gathered to remember not just her sacrifice, but the lesson she taught us about the nature of civilization itself. She showed us that true strength is not measured in the power to destroy, but in the willingness to preserve. Not in the ability to conquer, but in the choice to protect. Alina felt tears gathering in her eyes as she watched the mixed crowd of beings listening to Storm Eyes speak. Zephyrians stood alongside humans, their ancient enmity replaced by mutual respect. But they were not alone. Dozens of other species had sent representatives, all of them touched in some way by the story of what had happened here. The Chen Memorial had become more than a monument to one person's sacrifice. It had become a symbol of what the galaxy could be when its inhabitants chose cooperation over conflict, protection over predation. In Zephyrian tradition, Storm Eyes continued, "We believe that the dead live on in the actions of those they have influenced. By that measure, Sarah Chen is not gone. She lives in every treaty signed between former enemies, in every rescue mission that crosses species boundaries, in every moment when someone chooses to protect the helpless rather than exploit them." He gestured to his siblings who moved forward to join him at the base of the memorial. Each of them carried something. Not weapons or symbols of authority, but simple offerings that spoke to their connection with the human who had saved them. Storm Eyes placed a small holographic recorder at the base of the monument. When activated, it would play recordings of the cubs during their first months of life, preserved from the research station's databanks. The sound of their infant vocalizations, their first attempts at communication, their playful interactions with the toys Sarah had made for them. Gentle Claws offered a medical scanner, the same model that Sarah had used to monitor their health during those crucial months. Shadow Walker left a datapad containing detailed observations of their behavior, written in Sarah's own hand and recovered from the station's computers. The other siblings followed suit, each leaving something that connected them to their lost guardian. By the time they were finished, a small collection of artifacts surrounded Sarah's holographic form, not valuable in monetary terms, but priceless as reminders of the bond between a human scientist and the alien children she had chosen to protect. As the formal ceremony concluded, Elena noticed something that made her smile, despite the solemnity of the occasion. Throughout the gathering, she could see small groups of beings from different species talking quietly among themselves, sharing stories and experiences that transcended traditional boundaries.
A Zephyrian warrior was deep in conversation with a human marine, both of them comparing notes about the children they had left at home. A group of ethereal singers was harmonizing with human musicians, creating music that no single species could have produced alone. Representatives from the non-aligned worlds were discussing joint research projects that would have been impossible just a few years earlier. The memorial had become what Sarah Chen herself would have wanted, not just a monument to the past, but a foundation for the future. As the crowd began to disperse, Storm Eyes approached Elena one final time. "Ambassador, there is something my siblings and I wanted to discuss with you." Elena waited, curious about what the Zephyrians might have in mind. "We have decided to establish a foundation in Sarah Chen's name," Storm Eyes explained. "Its mission will be to support research into interspecies cooperation and to provide aid to refugees and orphans throughout the galaxy, regardless of their origin. We wanted to ask if the human government would be willing to partner with us in this effort." Elena felt her heart swell with pride. This was exactly the kind of legacy that Sarah would have wanted, not a static memorial, but a living institution dedicated to protecting the vulnerable and building bridges between species. "I think I can guarantee that humanity will be honored to participate," she replied. Dr. Chen would be proud to know that her sacrifice continues to save lives across the galaxy. Storm Eyes bowed in the Zephyrian gesture of deep respect. "She will never be forgotten, Ambassador. Not by us, not by our children, not by any generation that follows. Her story has become part of our cultural memory, a reminder that the highest form of courage is choosing to protect those who cannot protect themselves." As Elena prepared to return to her ship, she took one last look at the memorial. The setting sun was casting long shadows across the monument, but Sarah Chen's holographic image remained bright and clear, a beacon of hope in the growing darkness. Around the world, the lights of other memorials were beginning to glow. The Chen Memorial had inspired similar monuments on dozens of planets, each one a testament to the power of sacrifice and the possibility of redemption. What had begun as one person's choice to save 7 alien children had grown into a movement that was reshaping galactic civilization. Elena thought about the report she would write when she returned to Earth, about the ceremony she had witnessed and the foundation that would soon be established. But more than that, she thought about the story she would tell her own children, about a scientist named Sarah Chen who had shown the galaxy what it truly meant to be human. In the end, that might be the greatest memorial of all. Not the monuments or the foundations or the peace treaties, but the simple act of remembering. Of passing down the story of someone who had faced an impossible choice and chosen love over fear, protection over self-preservation, hope over despair. The human who gave her life for predator cubs would never be forgotten, because her sacrifice had become part of the galaxy's collective memory. And in a universe full of conflict and competition, that memory served as a constant reminder that sometimes the most important victories were won not through strength or cunning, but through the simple decision to care for those who needed protection. As Elena's ship lifted off from the memorial world, she could see the lights of the monument growing smaller below. But she knew that the light of Sarah Chen's sacrifice would never dim, because it lived on in the hearts and minds of beings across the galaxy who had learned that true strength came not from the power to destroy, but from the courage to preserve and protect. The memorial world fell away beneath them, but the memorial itself would endure, a permanent testament to the day when one human showed the entire galaxy what it meant to be truly civilized.